Ms. Maha and Ms. Saadia. Welcome to the 28th session of the Learners Republic Policy Fellowship. Our topic for today is the energy policy, and we couldn't have invited anyone better. And I know I say that a lot, but today I mean it more than I do on any other day. We have two fantastic ladies with us. So we have with us Saadia Qayyum, who's an energy specialist at the World Bank, also chair of Women in Energy in Pakistan. And we also have with us Maha Kamal, who is the co-chair of Women in Energy in Pakistan. And the title that the title bearers as they are, it just creates intrigue because it's a very powerful title to have, a energy policy and then women in energy. So yes, Vajiha, we are also very excited for this session. Ms. Sadia and Ms. Maha, we are a cohort of diverse learners. So within us, we have students at different stages of their academic career. So starting from undergrads all the way to PhD scholars, we are very diverse in terms of disciplines. So we have environmental science students and practitioners, architecture, medical sciences, economics, and then we have political science. So there's a whole spectrum that we are trying to cover. There's also a lot of lateral learning in terms of ages. So from 22 to all the way to, I think, 30s, 40s. We also have civil servants amongst us. And we are very, very happy to have you today speak to us about energy policy. That said, I will hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Fatma. I'm going to go first. Thank you for the introduction, and Assalamu alaikum to all the policy fellows. I have actually watched some of the videos, and I think the experience that these policy fellows are getting with this fellowship is amazing. It's quite enriching in terms of the speakers that you've gotten. I am an energy specialist at the World Bank, as Fatma has already said, and I have 8 years experience in the energy sector in Pakistan. So after doing my master's, मैं energy sector के, power sector के, particularly इधर ही घूमती रही हूँ. So today we're going to talk about what is happening in the power sector. And then Maha will talk about oil and gas and global energy transition, or what's happening globally in oil and gas. Before I delve into my presentation, let me take a quick poll from all of you. So you're all electricity consumers. You all concerned about what happens in the power sector. And of course, you've been reading about all the news that's coming out of the power sector. We are under 22nd, I think, IMF program, World Bank, DPC. They all talk about electricity, increase the electricity prices and power, and the government needs to do more for reducing the circular debt. And so, I mean, there's a lot happening. But I want to take a quick poll and ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge for Pakistan's power sector? And let me share my screen here. Oh, host has disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, I've started getting answers, but let's just hold on. I have a poll for you. If you
You
could,
can check. Are you
it
able
says
to
host.
share screen now?
Let me check again. I can, yes, I can do that now. Give me a second. Okay. Okay. Wait, where's screen share? Where's yeah, okay. And what do you see? My screen? No. Yes, it's there now. So can you all go to www.menti.com, and there's a code given over there. As you see on your screen, type in the code and you will see this question. So the code is 2973884. Let me know if you have any problems going to this question.
Saadia, can we drop the code in the comments so that they can copy paste?
Sure. Let me see. Let me see. How do I open the chat? So it's 29. Fatma, if you can write the code in the chat box, it's 29. 73884.
Okay. Okay, somebody has already written it. 2973884. Great.
And there's no right or wrong answer for this. It's just your opinion. So we have 4, 6, 7, 8 people. We still have more than 10
This was
people.
such a great feature. I'm learning so much about features to Mentimeter. Like, you can see it adjust
Size,
live,
yeah, you can see the answers coming in live.
right? If we had like 500 learners or something, it would be a nice time lapse or something.
And I'm using the free features. There's only one question here.
Oh, okay. Yes, they suddenly make you pay for everything. I've realized
Yeah.
all these websites.
This was cheapest. It was like $9, but I still did not end up paying. But there was
$9
other.
is a lot for 4 or 5 questions,
Yeah.
unless World Bank is
Okay.
paying for it.
Yeah, no, World Bank is paying me, so I can pay for this from my
Great.
salary. But anyway, so we have I think 11, 12, 15, 16 people have answered. I think we still a few more to go, but that's fine. So as you can see, a lot of people think that circular debt is a very big challenge for Pakistan's power sector, followed by 5 people who think governance issues and then dependence on important fuel. And these are all right answers. And if you see the other four, like the high tariffs, imported fuel, inadequate electricity infrastructure, and governance issues, are all those that has led to the circular debt issue. And we'll talk about it in my presentation today. So let me stop sharing this, and I'm going to start sharing my presentation now. Okay. Yeah. So as you all rightly identified, Pakistan's power sector has been characterized by boom and bust cycles of electricity deficit, followed by periods of electricity surplus. Now, if you remember 2013, when the PMLN government came, the biggest thing on their agenda was to bridge the demand supply gap and to get rid of load shedding. 2008 is when load shedding started. 2002, 2003, I remember that's when all we had the 1994 IPP policy and the 2002 IPP policy, and we had a lot of private sector investment in the power sector. And we actually thought that we were going to start exporting power to India because at that time we thought we had excess capacity. But then, because investment didn't happen for a long time, we again fell into a period of deficits. And now, again, after several years of shortages, we now have a surplus capacity, which has become a problem because you have all this megawatts of electricity capacity payments that we need to pay for, but there's no demand, or there's the demand growth isn't there. We have a circular debt of 2.3 trillion rupees, which I think now by the end of this end of December, I think it's gone to 2.4 trillion. The government needs to give 300 billion rupees of annual subsidy. Losses are around 20%, whereas the world average is, I think, 10%. And it's still a single buyer market with very limited competition. It's one CPPAG that procures electricity on behalf of all the distribution companies. You remember 1998, unbundling happened, WABDA was broken, and then we had these generation companies, we had transmission company, and all the distribution companies. And the idea was that this was like the beginning of more competition in the sector, but that really didn't happen. Um, then you have an environmental challenge where only 5% of your installed capacity is coming from solar and wind. If you add hydro, that's 27%, around 32% is green energy. And then it's a social problem because you have high electricity tariffs, which are unaffordable for a very large segment of the population. And if we talk about electricity access, 140 million are energy poor in the country. So these are some statistics on electricity demand and supply. So if you look at electricity demand, a major consumer of electricity is still the domestic sector, followed by industrial sector 25%, and then agriculture and commercial. Now, in developed countries, the industrial or agriculture sector are the major consumers of electricity. These are productive sectors. That's how it should be. But in Pakistan, even though our per capita consumption is very low, but still, because our industrial growth isn't that much, we have a domestic sector overpowering or dominating the consumption of electricity. And these are consumers which consume electricity at low voltage levels, they're high losses, and they're also consumers which need to be subsidized as well. Then you have electricity supply, where, as I was talking about earlier, we have 27% of electricity coming from hydropower. We have 40% that's still coming from oil, RFO, and HSD. Then we have coal, 13%. In the last few years, the government has added coal power plants, which are imported coal plants, and also now utilizing indigenous third coal. Solar and nuclear, I think, is 8%, and solar and wind is still less than 5%, and we have an RE policy enacted by the government. New RE policy, sorry, and we've had the 2006 policy since now what, more than 10 years. The total, sorry, in terms of ownership, 56% of the plants are owned by government. So these include the RLNG plants as well. These include GenCos. Then you have IPPs, which own 30%. So around 9 out of 30,000 megawatt of installed capacity, 30% is owned by private sector. And then 14% of this capacity comes from the CPEC plants. Now, for power sector, what should be the policy objectives? And these are the policy objectives that I think that the government should be looking at. And if you think there should be a fourth one, feel free to speak up or write in the box. But for me, the three important objectives of any power policy should be availability of reliable power, affordability, that consumers are actually able to afford the electricity that they're consuming, and then sustainability, whether you have a power sector that is financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable. Now we look at all these three objectives. How much has the government actually achieved with all the several policies that the government has enforced in the last 3 decades? So availability, we all know we have excess capacity now, but despite this excess supply, a lot of areas continue to experience 6 to 8 hours of load shedding because of the transmission and distribution system constraints. And government has this policy of zero load enforced load shedding in areas where there are high losses and power theft. And even if you discount those areas, there are several others which are not getting electricity despite not being that high loss areas, because the distribution system is just congested and not able to distribute or provide electricity to the end consumer. Our electrification rate is 71%, with many parts of Balochistan, KPK, and interior Sindh, which are not, the electric grid doesn't even exist over there. And in some areas, despite having an electric grid, the consumers are either not connected to electricity because it's expensive, the connection fee is expensive and they can't afford, or even if they are connected, they just don't get electricity for more than 4 or 5 hours a day. And in urban, it would run better. It's 96% to 97% according to latest figures. And in rural, it's 65%. And majority of our population lives in rural areas. Pakistan's electricity consumption is 412 kilowatt hours, which is comparable to countries in Africa. So Pakistan, just to put things in perspective, Pakistan, which is a country of 220 million people, only consumes, I think, 25 or 30% more electricity compared to Finland, which is just a population of 5.5 million people. You can see our electricity consumption is compared to other countries. And now, of course, we can talk about energy efficiency, whether we're using it with whatever electricity we're using it efficiently or not. But even, taking into account energy efficiency, our consumption is low because we haven't really industrialized the way we should have, or we're not basically using it productively. And then affordability. Now look at the figure on the left. So we have the blue bars actually show the cost of generation, as in you can see the cost of generation has been going up since 2002. And there was a strong correlation between oil prices and the cost of generation until around 2012 13. After that, you see that even though your oil prices have decreased, but your cost of generation keeps on increasing. And that's where the link between oil prices and your cost of generation broke, because we were moving away from oil or RFO based plants to more RLNG or coal based plants. But you see a very strong correlation between the exchange rate of Pakistan with the cost of generation. So as we've seen depreciation, this goes on till 2021 as well. There's the projected figures as well. And if you extend it further to 2023 or 24, you'll see even your cost of generation going or increasing even further, as your rupee depreciates. And if you compare your cost of generation, which is 9.2 cents per kilowatt hour, in India, it's 5.5. In Bangladesh, it's 6.8. Nepal, which is largely hydropower, it's around 3. I think only country in the region where you see where probably Pakistan's cost of generation is lower is Afghanistan and Maldives. And that's because they're largely dependent on diesel power generation. So while the previous government, very rightly, they focused on generation, but they didn't focus on procuring or getting capacity at affordable costs. And that's why we've ended up with all these 25 years of PPAs, which are dependent on your exchange rate. So your monetary policy and your energy policy, which should be aligned, or there should actually not be a link between the two, which we can do with competition. But because of these wrong contracts or wrong policy decisions, we've been stuck in a situation where anything that happens to the exchange rate adversely impacts your cost of generation. So looking at the cost of service, the average consumer the average tariff that we pay is around 13 rupees per kilowatt hour, whereas your cost of service, which is the actual cost of giving electricity or supplying electricity to the end consumer. And I'll briefly talk about all these different components of your service cost, is actually around 20 rupees, 19, 20 rupees per kilowatt hour. And what are these different components? So first, of course, is your energy charge, which is your fuel cost. And over the years, as we've moved away from RFO based generation, towards coal, towards HFO, towards RLNG, and also more hydropower, the fuel cost has actually gone down. So the energy charge, which is now around, as you can see, is 5 rupees per kilowatt hour, used to be 6 or 7 rupees per kilowatt hour. But on the other hand, your capacity payments have started to increase. And you saw a very sharp increase in the last 2-3 years, because of when this government came and we had a free floating exchange rate, that depreciation in the rupee increased your capacity payments, which is now higher than the fuel payments at 7.04 rupees per kilowatt hour. Then you have a transmission charge, which is 0.36, distribution margin, which the discos retain, which is 1.78. And then you have all these other costs added to it, which is the cost of, NEPRA allows 15% losses. So you build in that cost to your cost of service. Then you have, NEPRA assumes that the discos are going to collect 100% of the payments of the bills that they have billed to the consumer, but our discos end up only collecting 90% of it. So then again, if to explain it in simple terms, if you're consuming, if the generators produce 100 units of electricity, 2% of it is lost in transmission. Then you have another 10%, 15%, that is lost in distribution. Then you have, out of the 85 units, whatever 86 units that the consumers get, you only collect 90% of it. So all of this is adding to your cost of service. And then the another 2-3 components that very few people know about is your debt service and the markup of stock. So I mean, I think it's getting a little more a little complicated. Let me go to talk about the circular debt first, and then I'll come back to it because there are two components to circular debt, and that's where your debt service and markup of stock comes. But looking at this, what are the factors that impact the cost of service? So fuel prices, of course. अगर आपकी जो है oil की price बढ़ेगी तो logically you know that your fuel price, your energy charge is going to go up. Exchange rate अगर devalue होगा rupee, तो then your capacity charge is going to go up, right? If your interest rate increases, the debt payments that the IPPs need to make will go up. और क्योंकि वो built in ये सारी pass through cost है, so if the debt repayment goes up, then your capacity charge goes up, and in the end, the tariff that the consumer is paying will go up. अगर आपके distribution losses जो हैं वो ज़्यादा होंगे, obviously वो आपकी cost of service को it will adversely impact, and similarly अगर आपके collection 90% से 95% हो जाएंगे तो again your cost of service will increase. और या and the reason this slide is important is because you see the red dotted dash line, आपका average जो tariff consumer pay करे, that's only 13 rupees. Whereas the actual cost that the government is incurring or the sector is incurring is 20 rupees. So this gap of 20 and 13, that's 7 rupees, that's what is creating the deficit in the sector. Then talking about the sustainability in terms of environmental sustainability. Aapka power generation mix, as you see, hydropower is just 27%. You have from 2017, 2020 onward, sorry, to 2020, you see कि आपका dependency on imported fuel. First it was RFO, now we moved to RLNG and coal plants, and we have I think 6,000, 7,000 megawatts of coal that Pakistan has already locked itself into some under construction. Even though the Prime Minister has announced that there will be no more coal power plants, but there are few that are already under construction, so they will come online. And the circular debt is, financial sustainability में it's 5.3% of the GDP. और हमारी जो tax collection है वो 6.5% GDP है. So you can imagine the enormous amount of deficit that the sector faces. It's a leakage in your national exchequer. जो हम power sector के, and it's not that we've been able to curtail it in the past few years. It just keeps on increasing. And I was talking about disco losses. I mean, अगर average जो है वो 10% होगा world का, हमारा जो है वो I think distribution losses is 18%. Add the transmission losses another 2-3%, so that's around 20% is just your T&D losses. And the performance of the distribution companies, even though the previous government worked on adding power generation and increasing the installed capacity, but what they didn't work on was actually improving the distribution infrastructure. Transmission, I won't say, because transmission ke upar work has been done. Though, of course, as you add more plants, you need to build more transmission lines as well. But NTDC performance compared to DISCO performance has still been much better. Distribution companies, and if you see PESCO, SEPCO, HESCO, KESCO, ये जो पेशावर की हैं, नॉर्थ की हैं, या फिर जो Sindh and Balochistan, their performance in the last 5-6 years have really not improved. So I was talking about circular debt. So as the term suggests, the circular debt is basically the sector cash flows which results from after the DISCOs have collected their bills and paid to CPPAG, which is procuring power on behalf of the distribution companies from the IPPs. And then the Ministry of Finance pays subsidy to, as I was talking about, कि the 13 rupees जो average tariff है और cost of service ज़्यादा है, तो जो gap है वो some portion of that gap is being filled by Ministry of Finance through subsidy. So circular debt is essentially the deficit that remains कि जब डिस्कोस ने अपने पैसे कलेक्ट करके CPPAG को दे दिए, Ministry of Finance ने जो subsidy portion अपना जो budgeted था वो दे दिया, उसके बाद जो deficit बचता है आपके cash flow में, that is essentially your circular debt. So just going over the figure, so you can electricity consumers. Let me see if I can have a highlighter, laser pointer. Yeah. So consumers, which are your electricity consumers, they pay to DISCOs for the electricity that they're consuming. Then discos then they retain their distribution margin and they pay rest to the CPPAG. CPPAG, which is a single buyer of electricity, has to pay the IPPs and the government-owned plants, which are Aapke Wabda, which are your Gencos, which are your RLNG plants, for the electricity that they're generating. And the IPPs in turn have to pay to PSO and gas companies for the fuel that they are procuring from these companies for generating electricity. And then and these gas companies have to provide a service to consumers. So it's अगर इस पूरे chain में कहीं पे भी जो है वो cash shortfall हो, so that results in your circular debt. And if you look at the circular debt over years, it's just been increasing. 2014 में आप देखेंगे वो कम होता है. 2030 में the PMLN government came, they bailed out the sector and they transferred the CPPA के जो arrears थे that they had to pay to IPPs, they transferred it to PHPL. So PHPL is power holding company जो उन्होंने basically government एक vehicle बनाया हुआ है कि जहाँ पर जो CPPAG की पेबल्स हैं टू IPPs उसको करने के लिए कम करने के लिए they get loans from the bank. So what happens is, to explain in simple terms, अब जो power purchase agreement है उस पे clause होता है कि the government is supposed to pay the IPPs whatever the payment is due in 45 days. और अगर वो नहीं पे करते तो the government has to pay them a late payment surcharge at Khyber plus 4.5%. अब Khyber, I mean, it's a big amount. और Khyber अगर जब 13-14% हुआ था उस पे आप 4.5% add करते हैं. So that was a huge amount that the government was paying to IPPs. गवर्नमेंट ने क्या किया कि और अभी भी करती है कि वो आईपीपीज को पे करने के लिए कि ताकि उनको ये काइबर प्लस 4.5% ना पे करना पड़े, वो कमर्शियल बैंक से बोरो करते हैं. अब जब when they borrow from the bank, they have to pay the markup at Khyber plus 2%. So the loan that they're getting from the commercial bank is cheaper compared to what they have to pay to the IPPs if they're not अगर उनकी लेट पेमेंट होती है और गवर्नमेंट की काफी अरसे से लेट पेमेंट ही हो रही है. सो ये लोन लेते लेते उन्होंने जो PHPL का व्हीकल था उसमें दे हैव नाउ 1004 बिलियन जो है उन्होंने वहां पर उस स्टॉक में जमा हो गए हैं. मतलब उस व्हीकल में जो है ना वो हमने दिस इज व्हाट वी पेइंग टू द कमर्शियल बैंक्स. इसके ऊपर हमें 1004 बिलियन के ऊपर मार्कअप काइबर प्लस 2% दे रहे हैं. ऑन दी अदर हैंड हमारा आईपीपीज का भी जो पेबल्स है वो भी बढ़ता जा रहा है. सो 2019 में अगर वो था 812, that has increased to 1.15 billion or trillion, sorry. And so stock और PHPL के जो debt है उसको मिला के that is the portion that the government owes to the commercial banks as well as to the IPPs, and this is what the total circular debt amount is. तो आपको जो 2.3 का figure सुनते हैं ना वो basically is the addition of the PHPL debt that the government owes to the commercial banks at Khyber plus 2%, and then the CPPAG stock that the government owes to IPPs. So you must have been reading news about कि you renegotiate your agreement with the IPPs, and उसमें उन्होंने कहा है कि जी हम आपको we'll sign an agreement with the government जो MOU में clauses हैं, we'll reduce the return on equity, we will reduce the cost electricity tariff, the cost जो उनको IPPs को जा रही है, but you need to pay us the receivables, the payables that you owe to us. And they're basically talking about this portion, the CPPAG stock portion, which is the arrears that the government has to pay to IPPs. And you can see how FY 14 or actually 17 onwards, and 18 is when this PTI governments came, the circular debt flow, and this is a flow, this is the annual increase in the circular debt जो add करते जा रहे हैं. So FY 20 में 538 billion था, FY 19 में 420 billion था, 400 something, I'm forgetting the exact figure. But see, instead of curtailing this flow, the flow has been increasing over time. And the factors that have led to this increase is basically as we earlier talked about, distribution losses, your governance issues, your high electricity costs, because of which the government needs to subsidize. अनबजटेड सब्सिडीज अगर गवर्नमेंट ने अगर जो बजट करनी चाहिए या जो रिक्वायर्ड है अगर वो 300 बिलियन है, गवर्नमेंट इज ओनली द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ फाइनेंस इज ओनली डिस्पर्सिंग हाफ ऑफ इट. अगर आप इकोनॉमिक सर्वे पे जाके देखें तो उसमें लास्ट ईयर के आप लास्ट 2-3 years के आप सब्सिडी देख लें, सो द बजटेड सब्सिडी has always been less than what the actual subsidy required has been. So where that the gap between the budget and actual subsidy, where does it go? That goes in the circular debt. उसका no one's paying for it. वो आपके stock में आ जाता है. So we're talking about the key stakeholders in the power sector. So of course, I mean, your generation companies here, you have the IPPs, you have WABDA, which is, just now only generating hydropower. You have GENCOs, you have nuclear, which is Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission. They all sell electricity to CPPA, and CPPA then provides some electricity to Karachi Electric and the 10 regional distribution companies. Karachi Electric, of course, is privatized, so it has its own generation, and buys electricity from some SPPs. And then you have National Transmission and Dispatch Company, which essentially transmits electricity from your generators to the distribution companies. फिर आपकी फैसिलिटेटर्स आए, आपके पेपको है जो ओवरसी कर रहा है आपकी डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनीज को. You have PPIB, which is the board that was formed in 1994 to attract private sector investment and act as a one window of facility for private sector interested in generation in Pakistan. Then you have the provincial energy departments. In 18th amendment ke baad, electricity is a provincial subject. So now you can have provinces that can set up energy projects, and also give guarantees on behalf of the province. And then you have the Alternate Energy Development Board, which is the role of which is to work on renewable energy in the country. फिर उसके बाद आपके ऊपर बैठा हुआ है इन सबको देखता हुआ, स्पेशली गवर्नमेंट की जो अंडर आती हैं अंडर आते हैं डिपार्टमेंट्स, इज द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एनर्जी. उसका रोल essentially होना चाहिए था provide giving policy directors, but actually monitors and oversees all of these stakeholders, which include आपके GENCOs, which include WABDA, which include AADB, जो भी government की ownership के में है departments and agencies, उसको oversee कर रहा है Ministry of Energy, and has a lot more participation in the private sector than it should have. And then of course आपके उसके ऊपर जो है Cabinet Committee on Energy. And then you have NEPRA, which is the regulator, which again oversees and regulates the power sector. And the role of NEPRA is extremely important, because अगर हम थोड़ा सा आगे जाके बात करेंगे कि किस तरह जो है पॉलिसीज के ऑब्जेक्टिव्स क्या थे और वो फुलफिल हुए हैं कि नहीं हुए हैं, या फिर कराची इलेक्ट्रिक की प्राइवेटाइजेशन के ऊपर बहुत बात होती है कि whether that privatization was actually benefited or not. So when you introduce competition in a sector, the role of regulator is extremely important in seeing that the private players, and not just the private, but the public sector players as well, are actually fulfilling this, providing service at reasonable rates and efficiency. So the other stakeholders, अब ये तो आपके जो पिछली स्लाइड थी उसमें तो आपके stakeholders हैं जो on the face of it but आपके key जो stakeholders हो गए. But there are other stakeholders as well who influence power sector, and they're very important. So Cabinet Committee on Energy you talked about, और ये सारा जो IPP के साथ जो renegotiations हो रही हैं, जो decisions हो रहे हैं कि gas provide करनी है कि नहीं, industrial sector को tariff increase होना है कि नहीं, तो वो Cabinet Committee on Energy बैठ के they're taking these decisions. Then you have Ministry of Finance, which is again because of the circular debt issue and because they're the ones who budget the subsidy and disperse subsidies. That's another very important stakeholder in the power sector. Then you have the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, which has influence on what happens with the electricity tariff, whether industry ka tariff कम होना चाहिए, बढ़ना चाहिए, off peak rate होना चाहिए, peak rate होना चाहिए. I mean, there are a lot of news that came that you would have seen in the last 3-4 months, जो इलेक्ट्रिसिटी इंडस्ट्री जो है that is being affected कोविड की वजह से, and that's why any electricity they should get relief in the electricity tariff. So that was Ministry of Industry and Commerce that was pushing it. Then you have the IPP's Advisory Council, you have All Pakistan Textile Manufacturers Association, Industrial Agriculture Associations, local investors and banks का बहुत ज़्यादा इसमें stake है, क्योंकि whatever happens, whatever deal that happens with between the government and the IPPs, that affects their debt repayment. Then your international financial institutions such as IMF and World Bank. I mean, IMF pushing for higher electricity tariff, pushing for power sector reforms. World Bank pushing for power sector reforms, and they've been key players in what happens in the power sector, lobbying for reforms. And then, of course, you have the electricity consumers. So then you've had, looking at the timeline of power policies, your first policy came in 1994, and that was essentially to attract private sector investment. 1995 was hydropower because हमने उस वक्त था कि we should also exploit our indigenous resources, and that's when the 1995 policy was introduced by the government. उसके under I think only Newbong Escape or Lare Power was the only hydropower that came that was commissioned under that policy. 2002 was basically policy continued the corporate or fiscal incentives that were introduced in 1994 policy, but instead of having a levelized or front-loaded tariff, because 1994 policy में ये था कि there will be for the first 10 years you'll have a 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour tariff, and then later on it reduces. Like in 2002 में there was ये था कि there will be no front loading of tariff and you'll have a levelized or a cost plus tariff. 2006 renewable energy policy was, gave a target of having 5% renewable energy in the energy mix by 2030. And we know कि उसमें से कितना उसमें I think कोई शायद 14-1500 megawatt of RE add हुआ था by 2019. 2013 was having a sustainable power sector, and the government at that time, and this policy was brought about by PMLN, and their focus was reducing the load shedding or eliminating the load shedding, because when they came to Usfata, you would remember that there was a lot of blackouts and load shedding that the country faced. 2015 was utilizing indigenous resources, moving towards cleaner and cheaper fuels. And 2019 policy, the latest policy IA, which was basically introducing competitive bidding and competition, and giving a target of 25, or actually rather 30% renewable energy by 2030. This is from the indicative generation expansion plan. अगर किसी का भी power sector में interest है, I would recommend them to go over this document. इसके भी एक और iteration होगी जो I think वो 2027 तक 2048 तक देखेगा. But this is what the government has envisioned for how the energy mix is going to change. So you see कि coal or RLNG and RFO say you're going to move towards more hydropower, more solar and wind. So the objective is basically to reverse the electricity mix from 35% hydro and renewable energy today to 65%. Oh, and just sorry, this is a typo, in 2030. And we've now got the 2019 RE policy, but let's see. उसके बाद 2019 जब वो policy आई है उसके बाद actually अभी तक तो कोई renewable energy का project add नहीं हुआ है, क्योंकि yeah, so I think this is a good place to talk about that RE policy. Even though we have one, अभी तक कोई auctions के ऊपर कुछ भी काम नहीं हुआ है. There was a moratorium on having more renewable energy by the previous government because they thought that they had excess capacity, which is true to an extent. कि हमारे पास coal और RNG plants इतने हो गए and the electric demand hasn't increased as the previous government had thought that it would. जिसकी वजह से now we're in a situation where CPPAG isn't signing any more agreements. NEPRA is still giving cost plus tariff, even though the RE policy says that there would be competitive bidding. ADB has not actually come up with documents or a bidding strategy. They're still working on one. And this policy uncertainty has basically led to not enough or actually no investment to this at this point. No further investment has been done in renewable energy compared to a year ago. I see a lot of, sorry, chat me, there are questions coming. I don't know if Fatma, you can have a look at the questions, whether you
Sure.
want me to answer these questions now, or we can take them later. But we have two, three slides left of mine, and then Maha will come.
Okay, great. Ms. Sadia, we would have to conclude by 7:30, so we will have
Oh,
another
okay, okay,
speaker
okay.
coming in.
Oh, right, okay. I thought we had 6 to 8. So sorry. So I'm going to speed up now.
I'm sorry, there
Um,
was a
s-
slight change in schedule, so it just happened.
Oh, no, no problem at all. So power sector reforms that would be necessary, and the reason I want to go over the slide was because when you read the news, you know what exactly is happening. So one is, of course, we in order to reduce the power cost, which is 9.2, and as we talked about, it's 25% higher than what's happening in other countries. You need to first increase the share of renewable energy, then renegotiation of PPAs, which the government has already embarked upon. Let's see what materializes. But there's hope that some IPPs have actually are going to sign agreement with the government to reduce the return on equity. जो local projects हैं जिनको ये कर दिया गया था 2007 sorry 4-5 में कहीं के उनका जो return equity है that will be linked to dollar rupee exchange rate that has been delinked now. Then of course introducing competitive bidding, no more cost plus tariffs, no more upfront tariffs. We need to go to competitive bidding. Distribution companies, I mean, of course, we everyone know that we need to improve the distribution infrastructure. There are several measures that could be taken to that, but I think one which is very important is okay, we need to improve governance of discourse. Ministry of Energy needs to reduce its interference in what happens in who is hired, who is fired. All these discos have their board, and the board needs to be independent. The tariffs. IMF or World Bank बहुत in tariff की increase की बातें करते हैं. It's important that regulatory procedures are followed. NEPRA is given a free hand. I mean, it's a regulator. It should be making decisions rather than Ministry of Energy or Cabinet Committee on Energy कि कब tariff increase होता है और कब नहीं होता. You need to have timely increase in tariffs, and you need to have better allocation of subsidy, so that there's equitable distribution of burden. And just to give you one figure, 20% of electricity consumers are actually paying for 80% of the rest of the consumers. So after 80% subsidized, you should give a subsidy. I'm not against subsidy, but that subsidy has to be very efficiently targeted. And again, no unbudgeted subsidies. In terms of regulatory, as I said, no interference, and you need to increase transparency. So what's happening in other countries? The other countries have transitioned from a centralized system to competitive market. There's no single buyer market, except few developing countries. Or India का मैं example देख लें, which has a power sector which is very quite similar to Pakistan. तो वहाँ पे 10% जो है वो trade होता है on competitive market, और बाकी I think अभी भी 70-80%. And it varies from one state to another, but they're single buyer market, but they've also now increasing the share of competitive market from 10% to higher. Um, the long-term contracts need to go. We need to have auctions. You need to move away from centralized generation to distributed generation. So that's the advantage that we have with renewable energy efficiency, that is demand side management, has to be an integral part of your energy policy, and integrated energy planning. I think this is my last slide. So, I mean, global electricity mix में देखें, I mean, for a very long time, there were these lobbies which were against renewable energy. Okay, ये तो variable intermittent energy है, इसमें तो electricity mix जो है, हमारा अगर if we add more, our system isn't capable to absorb. And what about base load? There are ways to tackle this. Uske liye, yes, we will need to work on our transmission distribution infrastructure, but that's no cop out to say that we shouldn't have more renewable energy. और अगर आप globally देखें तो renewables are going to meet 80% of the increase in electricity demand in the next decade. And by 2030, your renewables, including your hydro, your wind, solar, are actually going to provide 40% of electric supply. When I was reading this news the other day, कि India में जो है coal is I think 6.5 Indian rupees per kilowatt hour, whereas जो उन्होंने solar के auction किए, that is 3 rupees per kilowatt hour. So I mean, long ago ये solar ने जो है उसकी, in terms of the reduction in electricity prices, it has overtaken your coal, which was thought as the cheap fuel. So the world is moving towards solar and wind, and that's where we need to move as well. And COVID, maybe when we saw reduction in electricity demand, we saw that the increase in this investments in solar projects were actually quite strong. Matlab, wahan pe you didn't really see a big fall in investments in solar. So this is my last slide. I'm going to hand it over to Maha now.
Thank you, Saadia.
Thank you, Saadia. So overall, my focus right now is going to be taking off from where Sadia left, which is the global electricity mix. So I'm not going to talk about the electricity mix, but I'm just going to draw your attention to the complexity of energy policy, right? And so my main focus is going to be drawing your attention towards how you actually make energy policy at a global level. What are the nuances you look at? So Sadia touched upon a few things, particularly she looked at availability, affordability, and I believe the third one was, Sadia, could you refresh my memory? You looked at availability,
Afford
affordability, and
sustainability.
sustainability, of course. Yeah, so I believe somebody left an interesting comment as well. The sustainability is important and is one of the highlights as well. So yes, absolutely. So I'm going to draw your attention to one of to these three, but also talking about how you actually integrate all of these when you're designing energy policy, right? And so I'm going to take it from there. Let me just open up my slides and we can then start. All right. So I hope you can all see my slides right now. Let me just make them
Yes.
bigger. Okay, excellent. Excellent. All right. Perfect. So first, a bit about myself. So you already know I am co-chair with Saadia for Women in Energy Pakistan. I also teach policy-related subjects, economics specifically, and public policy at the Information Technology University. And so energy policy is a topic that's very close to my heart and is what my dissertation also focused on as well, particularly on energy and climate and how they interact. So with that, our main aim for today is understanding the complexity of energy policy. And so trying to look at the nuances of how you actually design energy policy. So for those of you who are familiar with public policy literature, you would know that we often talk about ideas like muddling through in policy, right? Or so some people talk about like the stages model, that it's all neat when you design policy. But of course, anyone who has studied policy or is familiar with policy implementation knows that energy policy and other public policy issues are fraught with trade-offs, right? And of course, energy policy is no different. And we have a lot of trade-offs that you have to think about. And so the lens that you're using in order to, and your ideology or underlying motivations, depending on what your role is in the stakeholder matrix, defines how you actually approach energy policy, right? And so going over what Saadia has already shared with you, particularly from the power sector, you are now familiar with the different stakeholders in the power sector, right? And so similarly in oil and gas, when we think about the different stakeholders, we know that, of course, it's a regulator, which is OGRA, Oil and Gas Regulatory Authority. And of course, we have all of these other stakeholders. If you can go into detail in the Q&A as well, if you feel that's important. But you know that all of them have different motivations and different goals, right? And of course, they're all operating within the policy environment that is oftentimes determined by global goals as well, right? And so we can talk about that as well, how you actually design a good energy policy and what that looks like. For Pakistan specifically, I thought it would be important for us to understand the volatility of oil prices as well, because of course, historically, we've had a dependency on oil, particularly RFO, as Sadi already told you as well, when it came to the electricity as well, right? We've, of course, started to move away from that, and we've made some strides in that regard, but there's still, we as a, in energy policy are still affected by this volatility, and so we're going to talk a bit about that. And last, I end with the future of energy policy. So I've tried to keep it short, so that should be good. And then we can discuss most of these things that you're interested in the Q&A as well. All right. Okay. So, first of all, when we talk about energy, we know that and oftentimes what's interesting is that we talk about the fact that there are these deep disparities that define today's energy world, right? And I've taken this from World Energy Outlook 2019, which I thought did a good job in trying to draw your attention to the complexities that we think about when it comes to energy policy, right? And so there are these deep disparities in the oil markets, there are geopolitical tensions, there's, of course, the whole goal of carbon emissions, particularly as it relates to the Paris Agreement. Of course, with Biden coming into office again, we know that Paris is going to be again in importance. We can talk about that as well, how that influences energy policy when you have global climate goals, right? And of course, we have the policy and the whole idea that energy needs to be accessible for all, right? So energy access is of fundamental importance. And Saadia highlighted that as well when she told you that when it comes to energy per capita, we know that we're far behind what it could be, right? Of course, not getting into the efficiency debate. But of course, lack of electricity access for 850 million people around the world is of fundamental importance when it comes to global energy policy, right? And we know that energy systems around the world are undergoing these rapid transitions from the way we fuel our cars. For example, you could think about this whole transition towards electric vehicles as well, how we heat our homes, that's important, how we build our homes if you're going to make them efficient, and try to keep that in mind, how you power our industries. So all of these are questions that are of fundamental importance when it comes to energy policy, right? And these trends have these widespread implications for not only businesses, but they have these implications for governments and for individuals at a very basic level, right? At a micro level. And so there's this competition that we can think about how do we provide energy for all, right? What needs to be the source of energy, and how do you actually transition towards greener energy, right? Or cleaner energy. And so we know that there have been great strides in the renewable sector as well, right? For example, within our region, you can see China and India as well, who are actually trying to move away from coal in Asia's power sector as well, right? We know that developing countries in Asia actually account for over half of the global growth when we think about generation and renewable, right? And of course, in all of this is our transition from the whole idea of dirty energy towards clean energy, right? And so that brings into importance natural gas as this transition fuel as you move away from cleaner towards cleaner energy, right? And so we know that demand for natural gas has also been growing as its clean fuel of choice in this transition period, right? And so we know that there's been an increase of over 70% in Asia's natural gas consumption, right? And that has largely come from imports, which brings liquefied natural gas, which is LNG, into importance, right? And of course, that's fundamental to Pakistan as well. We can talk about LNG as well if you are interested in the Q&A in more detail. How do you hash that out as well? But of course, fundamental to all of this is the whole question of affordability, right? How do you make your energy competitive? And so competitiveness of gas comes into question because there's this idea that price sensitivity becomes of fundamental importance, right? And so when we think about the entire region, we know that primary energy demand is expected to grow by over 40%, right? According to the International Energy Agency. And so when we think about global growth, and we have to think about how are you going to give energy to all, right? And so that's important. This is just to give you a whole broader scheme of things. How does energy policy actually fit in terms of global energy, right? Of course, fundamental to all of this is how you actually consume, what the market looks like. And that brings us to the idea that especially in terms of the primary energy, how do you actually go through with that, right? And so this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. And this is a great source if you're actually interested in data on a global level in terms of world energy as well, right? So this is from the BP. And so you see here that over time we've seen that in fact we continue to consume oil as well, right? So in terms of energy world consumption, this is from 2020, and so you see historically while the share is flattening, we still see this major consumption as well, right? Coal is still of importance, and of course is natural gas. And while we see this fundamental increase in terms of renewables as well, especially in terms of being almost non-existent in the 90s to becoming a sizable portion of our energy mix. But you still see that that's pretty much a fraction at the moment. Of course, the projections are going otherwise, right? So in terms of the trends, that's of importance as well. So how do you actually position your own energy policy as Pakistan within this whole global policy environment, right? And so that brings us to our goals. What do our goals look like for energy policy, right? And some goals that are of importance are again related to affordability. Is energy cheap? Then it comes to sustainability. Is it clean? Then there's a whole idea about energy security as well, right? Is it secure? Particularly in terms of we're seeing that especially as you move towards smarter grids and a smarter power or smarter energy, you're increasingly exposed to these vulnerabilities in terms of security as well, right? And so when it comes to the whole idea, is it do you have uninterrupted availability of energy? Is it at an affordable price? And is it sustainable, not only in terms of what Saadia told you in terms of financial sustainability or environmental sustainability, but also in terms of this larger lens of energy security, right? And so the International Energy Agency defines energy security as this uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price, right? And what is important for us is to consider that long-term energy security actually looks at investments in line with economic developments and environmental needs, right? While short-term energy security tells us about how our system actually reacts to these sudden changes in the energy supply and demand mix, right? And so that becomes a fundamental importance. And so when we think about the whole idea of is our energy cheap, is it clean, is it secure, and in terms of have this broader umbrella of sustainability, then we have to think about what are our policy objectives, right? And so we can think about these as what you can call these three conflicting goals of energy policy as well, right? Because if you think about these, having all of these at the same time is again not necessarily possible because of the whole idea that you always have trade-offs. So you have to choose what do you actually want in energy, right? And so that brings us to what I was telling you about your ideological focus as well, right? So when you're actually designing policy in terms of energy policy, you have to think about the international political economy of energy, right? What are the underlying factors that actually influence energy policy, right? And so, depending on your ideology, you're going to have either a focus for, let's say, you'll ask the question, who is your energy for, right? Is your energy for the economy? In that case, you might lean towards market liberalism, right? Because you're going to say that your priority in energy security is that there is this economic affordability. And so that will underpin what your energy mix looks like, right? If you answer the question, energy security for whom, and you say, oh, energy should be important for the state. So in that case, you might lean towards what we call this neo-mercantilist view, right? Because having this geopolitical availability would be of fundamental importance to you. If you ask an environmentalist, who is this energy security for, or not even an environmentalist, if you ask any person who cares about the environment, they're going to say that, oh, you need environmental sustainability as underpinning your energy policy focus, right? So you might say, oh, even if renewables are, let's say, more expensive in the short run, you might choose to invest on those as well, right? And lastly, there's the whole idea that is your energy security for society, for other humans around you. In that case, you might focus on principles of equity and justice and have what you can call the social green view, right? So what I wanted to draw your attention towards is the fact that your ideological focus is going to define your energy policy lens. And that has we've historically seen towards our Pakistani energy policy documents as well, right? Depending on the leanings, the ideological focus, we have seen these different shifts. For example, as Saadia recently told you, we've seen this greener energy perspective from the Prime Minister Imran Khan, right? So he's tried to move toward away from coal, right? So things like that, right? And so whoever is the dominant policy actor at the point, they bring in their own ideology, and that defines how actors, institutions, and different stakeholders actually frame global energy policy, right? So that becomes of fundamental importance. So, as a developing country, and particularly for Pakistan, we sometimes fall into what you call emerging economies, right? And so, as an emerging economy for us, what is important is that we are able to deal with the vulnerabilities, that we have sufficient capacity in order to deal with energy. We have this high energy intensity, and we're able to deal with rapid demand growth, right? And so for Pakistan as an emerging economy, that becomes of fundamental importance, right? And you may contrast this from the industrial countries who may have a focus on, let's say, reducing import dependency or fixing aging infrastructure. Of course, that's important to us as well. But what becomes of fundamental importance is your role in terms of your goal as this emerging economy as well, right? And so now that you understand this whole global picture of energy policy, I next want to draw your attention towards oil price. All right. And so we've already looked at the fact that oil still plays a huge role in terms of energy consumption, right? And to this day, oil is of fundamental importance in how it actually creates this whole vulnerability, particularly because of what we call oil price volatility, right? So we see these large fluctuations, and we're going to explore that shortly as well. And so what happens is that basically it's a game of supply and demand, right? And what happens is that while supply and demand actually impacts oil prices, we have what we call oil futures that actually set the price of oil, right? And so we have these futures contracts, which are these binding agreements that give the buyer the right to buy a barrel of oil at a set price in the future, right? And so we see that play out, particularly when oil price went negative, right? We saw that happening. In 2020, which was unprecedented, right? And we'll try to talk about that, hash that out, how that affects your basically your energy policy goals and that dependency on oil. So just to have a quick look. So the picture below this, the screenshot is from today. This is oil price. I've said spring 2021, so that's from today. Today, oil price was at 55.66 at Brent, which is what Pakistan usually uses. So Brent price was $55 per barrel, right? And if you look at it just last spring, so the same time pretty much last year, you see that that was around 14, right? So just having this year on year comparison, you can see that there's this large fluctuation that you can think about in terms of what oil actually looks like and how much it fluctuates, right? And so we have to see, okay, what actually affects these oil prices, right? And so we know that oil is a commodity, that there are these large fluctuations in price, and in fact, we have what we call the OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which actually is responsible for regulating oil supply, right? And so they're in fact operate as an oligopoly, right? So for those of you who've studied economics, you would know how oligopolies work, how they influence prices. And so OPEC is a form of an oligopoly in that regard, that they are really influence the oil price, right? Of course, it's idea of supply and demand. If there's going to be falling demand, if it's going to be an oversupply, there's going to be these pressures on oil prices. So there's also the effect of external shocks, such as natural disasters. They can be political unrest. For example, there's this narrow strait of Hormuz that is often in the news because that narrow strait actually has about 90% of world oil passing through that, right? So it's between Iran and Qatar. And so we see that in the news as well, because political uncertainties affect that passing of oil as well, right? Particularly when it came to containers. Production costs can influence it, and storage capacity, and of course there's some correlation of interest rates affecting oil price as well. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail, so just a quick snapshot here in terms of what crude oil prices actually look like. Again, this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, so if you're interested you can go through that as well. And so what we see here is that major world events have often affected oil price, right? For example, there's the Asian financial crisis, there was the Arab Spring, there was the Iranian Revolution, the Suez Crisis, so on and so forth. So you can go all the way, you can have data from 1861 all the way up till 2019 that shows you that world events have this correlation in terms of influencing US dollars per barrel, which is the oil price, right? And so that brings into question the fact that if oil is that volatile from an energy security point of view, which is to ensure this uninterrupted availability of energy, where does that bring your energy policy, right? And so you would note that the majority, which is 48.3% of world energy, is in fact from the Middle East, right? In terms of the proven oil reserves, right? And so there's that great dependency on the Middle East in terms of oil. But we know for a fact that their oil reserves are actually oil reserves are this finite resource, right? We come back to the fundamental economic problem of scarcity, right? And oil as a scarce resource brings in its own problems, right? So where does the future lie? What does your future energy policy look like, in fact, right? And so for Pakistan particularly, what's important is that the consumption of petroleum products is 19.68 million tons per annum, which was against a supply of 11.59 million tons, which was from local refineries, right? And in fact, 8.09 million tons was actually imported, right? And so you can see that there's this large consumption of petroleum products that Pakistan has. And when oil price actually crashed last year, what we saw is that that basically really shows you that there's this high volatility, and so you can't base future energy policy completely on this oil, right? In fact, what we saw was that global economic changes, which were these increased oil prices that we're seeing right now as well, and this large fluctuation, in fact, causes these frictions in terms of what our economy actually faces, right? And so there have been these effects from trade protectionism, there have been regional frictions, and so all of that was actually aggravated because we've had insufficient forex reserves, we've had increased import bills, and then of course there's the ever green problem of trade balance, and how do you actually solve that, right, if you have this dependency on oil. So what has happened is that in recent years, Pakistan has actually tried to stabilize its impact, reduce its, for example, power sector's dependence on RFO, and try to move more towards LNG. Of course, LNG has its own problems that we can get into as well, right? But basically, in terms of the energy mix, we've seen that Pakistan has had a reliance on thermal sources of energy, right? So that's coal, oil, and gas for you. And so over time, we've tried to reduce that dependence, particularly in recent years. And so we have now imported coal in the mix, we have local coal, we have RLNG, we have natural gas. And so over time, we see that we've tried to reduce our dependence in terms of oil. And what we've seen is that the share of renewable has actually steadily increased over the years as well, right? In fact, the share of hydro has increased in recent years as well. And so we've had this historical variability that we can think of for each of these energy sources, right? And of course, you can connect this all to what we call this integrated energy plan, right? What does energy actually look like in terms of developing supply paths for the future, but also to have what you can call this evidence-based long-term policy options, right? How do you actually define what the mix should look like in the future? So our current energy mix is, of course, we have, and this is energy mix, so you must distinguish it from the electricity mix that Sadia has already told you about. But going back to our energy mix, we see that we have this 31% of oil, natural gas is 35%, RLNG is 9%, then we have coal at 13%. And so you will see that in terms of there's this huge dependence on thermal sources of energy, right? And when we were thinking about these broader questions of is your energy sustainable, oil, that becomes of fundamental importance as well. So I'm going to gloss over this because that wouldn't leave us time for questions. So I'm not going to go here. I'm going to leave you with two last slides and just going over these very quickly so that we have some time for questions. All right. And so in terms of oil, we really have to think about hedging oil. We have to think about building strategic reserves, and of course, improving your oil storage capacities, right? Both onshore and offshore. And long term, you have to think about reducing your dependency on imported oil. And of course, you have to always think about developing greater energy efficiency, right? So that's important when it comes to oil. For gas, what's important is that, again, we have what we call this high efficiency, low emissions, HELE is the abbreviation that we often use in the energy sector for that. In the short run, we will, of course, continue our exploration and production, which is ENP. You might bring into unconventional gas here as well, because, of course, Pakistan has shale gas reserves as well that we can think about. Of course, that brings into question investments, all of that. We can talk about that as well. Then there's the whole question about unaccounted for gas that you've often heard about, which is your UFG, which is essentially, you can think about it as a leaking bucket, right? So you have gas and then you lose gas. So where does it go? And so you have to fix that problem as well, right? Long term, you have to reduce dependency on natural gas because, as I told you, this is really this transition fuel that you can think about, but you have to move on from there in order to fulfill your broader goals for creating greater sustainability, which would be fulfilling your climate obligations as well, right? And so you have to reduce that dependency and again, develop greater energy efficiency. So with that, I'm going to just wrap it up. Thank you. I hope this was informative and really give you some ideas of how energy policy is actually formulated. Happy to take questions because I feel like if I don't wrap up now, we will not have time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you, Saadia. Your presentations were important to us, not only because of the detailed yet comprehensive insights into the energy policy and sector, but also because they reflect your commitment, understanding, and expertise in this otherwise traditionally male dominated discipline. So we are seeking inspiration from you as you were presenting, and I shall open the floor for questions right away. We can meet while the fellows conceptualize and formulate their questions. Sadi, if I could invite you to comment on your discussion with Granaz over solar energy in Balochistan.
I got to know that Kunal, who is actually operating solar system in her own house, which is very, very cool to have. But she was talking about how Balochistan has a lot of solar potential, and we know that Balochistan is largest in terms of geographic area and has the smallest population. So that means providing electricity in Balochistan is quite difficult because you need to transmit electricity over long lines, and they have KESCO with very high losses and low collections over there with immense solar potential and wind potential as well. It makes sense that instead of using transmitting electricity produced by thermal power plants and taking it to the communities in Balochistan, you actually set up micro and mini grids of solar and wind and use renewable energy and green energy to provide electricity in those areas. And I was actually telling her that World Bank is actually, we actually got a request from the Balochistan government to work on electrifying and powering educational institutes, hospitals in Balochistan. So that has made us think and conceptualize a project for an electricity access in Balochistan. I mean, still at conceptualization stage, and we need to talk with more with the Balochistan government. But I can, on my behalf, I can say that I'm actually leading technical assistance work on electricity access because Maha was talking about priorities of the government, and the government has not had priority to provide electrification or have provide a universal energy access to everybody. The focus has been on the 120 or 130 million people who already have electric grid, but what about those who are not connected to the electric grid? So there's no energy access strategy that the government has. There's no rural electrification plan. So first thing is we need to understand where it makes sense for us to extend grid and where it's not feasible. because there's fragmented population pockets. So over there, it would make sense to have micro and mini grids, which is now becoming quite popular in other countries. And also in some areas, micro and mini grids won't make sense because there's not enough anchor load. Over there, it would actually make sense to have standalone solar home systems. But we need to have some kind of study done to show in which areas it would make sense to extend the grid, where it's not financially economically viable to do that, and where mini grids would make sense. So yes, I was talking to her that there is a project in pipeline where we will see what makes sense for Balochistan and how we can electrify communities and businesses in that province, where the electrification rate right now is, I think, just 28%.
Thank you. Seher, on the premise and ideology of women in energy so that we can understand it better, the fellows who don't know what that is about. I also regret the loss of our 30 minutes. Seher, please go. Ji Seher. Seher, we'll come to you, I suppose. Maha, meanwhile, you could introduce us to. Okay, I think Seher is on board. Seher, आप सवाल पूछ लें. Right.
Ji, can you hear me now?
Ji, Seher, we can hear you.
Ji, can you hear me, Fatma?
Yes, we can hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes. Seher, I suppose आपको थोड़े connectivity के problems हो रही हैं. You can type your question in the chat.
Am I audible now?
Maha, meanwhile, we'll turn towards you.
Ji, there's a slight problem with my mic. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Ji, okay. Actually, it was a pleasure listening to the presentation because energy is very close to energy is very close to my heart. That's, in the energy department, Punjab government
Seher, we're still having trouble hearing you.
for a little
Seher, can you type
more
your
than 3
question
years,
in the
actually.
chat? In the meantime, if anyone else has a question, please go ahead.
I think I requested Maha to speak about women in energy as well and introduce our fellows to the concept and the premise. So we can
Sure.
hear from Maha. Thank you, Maha.
Thank you, Fatma, for giving Women in Energy the platform as well. As I have already told you, Saadia and I are both co-chairs. We're led by our national chair, Namira Hamid, as well. And so I believe Saadia's already shared the LinkedIn and our Twitter with you. So please follow us on Twitter or follow us on LinkedIn, whatever is easier for you. But Women in Energy is basically a platform dedicated to the professional and career growth of women in energy as well. We host different panels, webinars. Sorry, I think there's some distortion, so I'm just going to stop.
Can you hear me?
Seher, I believe
My
if that's
camera
you, it's very distorted. So if you can type, please, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, Maha, please continue.
All right. And so we host mentorship sessions for women in the energy sector. Of course, we started off with the idea that essentially, as Naveed was kind enough to say as well, that historically energy has been a male dominated sector in a lot of ways, right? And so we actually wanted to solve this problem and give early career women and mid career women access to mentorship and opportunities to help not only grow them but to develop leadership in energy, right? And so we've asked a lot of senior women in the energy sector to actually serve as role models for women in the energy sector as well. We focus on a lot of different areas. For example, we've had solar trainings for female engineers. We have hosted trips that are of a learning nature, for example, to different power plants. We host webinars, conferences, and of course, have this long-term view where we try to influence policy reform as well. And we've historically originally started with the support from the Punjab government and the energy department as well, right? And the Punjab Commission on the Status of Women. We work closely with them as well in order to develop women in the energy sector. Saadia, if there's anything I've missed, please feel free to add.
No, I think you've covered everything. I mean, the important point over here is that it has been a male-dominated sector, and a survey that was done showed that only 5%, women are only 5% of the total workforce in the power sector, and we have a number of females who are graduating from universities with STEM degree, with degree in electrical engineering, and also economists and lawyers who are part of the power sector. I encourage you, if you have any interest in among the fellows, if you have interest in power sector, it's a great field to be in, and especially, I mean, if you when you're a minority, there disadvantage, but there are also advantages as well. It's a nice network of women that we have built over here. It's a great community, and we help each other with mentorship, as Maha said, but also like getting you opportunities, highlighting women in the energy sector because they're very few, but they're doing great work. So if you any of the fellows here or anybody you know want to be part of the power sector, I've shared the links. Please do connect with us. And I've already found one member of this person. I don't know if I'll take her name correctly, Gana. Sorry, but
Nah,
the lady from Balochistan. Yes, yes. So I think already got one member of Women Energy, and we'll talk more with her.
Great.
that's
Um,
great, Sad. Thank you for filling us in on your work, and I really appreciate you encouraging us to be part of the work that you're doing. So before we conclude the session, let's take one question from Zainab Zahid. She's had her hand raised for a while.
Thank you, Asra. Thank you, Saadia and Maha, for being here and for your wonderful presentation. I'm an environmentalist, so I'll ask a question related to sustainability thing. Recently, there has been a lot of debate towards the in energy transfer towards the green transition and on the environment-friendly technologies. So, how do you see the role of carbon credits coming into play when it comes to energy sector? Because energy sector is also one of the major greenhouse gas emitter, major sector considered, which emits like around 46% of the emissions. So how do you see the like future of the carbon markets in Pakistan? And secondly, when we have a lot of potential for the solar energy generation, why do you think that why we have not been shifted towards the off the grid energy production, and especially when we can in fact even feed the extra energy into the main grid? What do you think from your personal experience? What are the issues, whether it's like operational thing or whether it's there is some wrong with the perception of the people? So yeah, I would like to know your opinion on these two issues.
Okay, I can take the solar question. Ma, do you want to take the carbon credits question? Oh, no.
uh, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm sorry, I'm already answering a question in the chat box by Umar. So
Okay,
if you can
okay,
repeat the
okay.
question, I'll be happy to take it.
Right. So, okay, I'll take the solar question first. So, Zena was asking, one, why we haven't seen a growth in off-grid solar market, even though there's great potential for solar. solar in Pakistan. And then I'll tell you the question that was on carbon markets. So solar, Zainab, what's happening is that you are increasingly seeing consumers, especially urban consumers, who are moving towards solar systems for powering their homes. You also see industries moving towards solar as well. In terms of off-grid, and I think when you say off-grid, you mean communities which are not connected to the grid. If that's what you mean, so as I said, government hasn't had, like, energy access has not been the priority of the government, though there has been some ad hoc efforts that have been done by the provincial government. But what they were doing was that, and I would say all the governments were giving out solar panels and these mini solar home systems for free to the consumers. And when you give out things for free, that doesn't work, because one, the consumer doesn't have any stake. The supplier that's providing that solar home system, he doesn't have any stake, because he's sold his system. उसके बाद he doesn't need to provide O&M and maintenance. तो अगर आपकी battery जो है, it stops working, if your solar panel stops working, then who do you go to? और उसमें हमने काफी देखा था कि ये जो गवर्नमेंट के पंजाब में, and I think it was true for Sindh and Balochistan as well, that you had people actually selling their solar panels in the market. So ये जो ad hoc efforts हैं, that need to be, one, you need to have private sector participation or investment coming into the off-grid sector, and there are few companies who've done that. Eco Energy is one example, जिन्होंने pay as you go system निकाला है. So you need to have stake of the consumer as well in the business model that these companies or the provincial governments come up with for distribution of solar home systems. लेकिन अब जो है, because price, एक तो standardization भी नहीं थी, and that's why people were wary of actually investing their money in whether it was an urban consumer or whether it was a rural consumer, because you had these really low quality cheap solar panels that were coming from, being smuggled from a neighboring country, China. And if you invest your money in a solar system and it doesn't work after a few months, and you have no guarantee कि आपका कोई वो service provider आके आपको जो है उसको service करेगा, तो then people were wary of actually investing their money. But ADB has done some work, has actually done good work on it, that they have this list of vendors that जिनके products जो हैं वो standardized हैं. So now that if I'm getting solar home system from A, B, C, what supplier, so their products are actually standardized, they're actually quality verified. So increasingly in the last 1 year, the investment in solar has actually gone, for off-grid or for distributed generation, has actually gone up. And then carbon market ke upar tha ki what is the potential for carbon market in Pakistan in the energy sector? If Maha, you want to take that.
Sure. Zainab, if you can repeat the question and tell us what you specifically wanted to ask.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to ask, when we have like energy sector as a major emitter of the greenhouse gases, और international community में ये एक debate भी चल रही है कि whether we can develop carbon markets or not. Even के COP में भी last time it was a major topic of discussion जिसके लिए कोई rule book नहीं है, right? So maybe I'm expecting कि इस साल COP में if it happens, तो it like सबका ये एक होगा concern कि we come up with a rule book for the carbon markets. तो obviously पाकिस्तान के अंदर इट्स डेवलपिंग कंट्री, वी हैव चाइना एज ए नेबरिंग कंट्री जो कि एक मेजर एमिटर भी है. तो हाउ डू यू सी कि आपके जो एनर्जी सर्कल में डिबेट चलती है, हाउ डू यू सी कि एनर्जी सेक्टर का इस पर्टिकुलर डोमेन में क्या रोल होगा, हाउ वी कैन टेक दिस चांस while utilizing the opportunities which are in our energy sector, कि हम किस तरह से कार्बन मार्केट्स को डेवलप कर सकते हैं एज एन इंस्ट्रूमेंट to regulate our carbon emissions as well as to have a monetary benefit from the other developed countries.
So great question, Zainab. That you're right in saying that historically that has been of fundamental importance in terms of developing a carbon market, right? And how Pakistan can actually play its role and basically benefit from this. And if you ask climate finance experts particularly, that has been a concern for climate in Pakistan as well. And so the problem at the moment is that the market is too small for Pakistan. If we continue to build it, and of course, if you can pool it and perhaps have a regional carbon market, that makes more sense. And so there's been talks in terms of climate stakeholders within Pakistan who've actually tried to group and have more of a regional carbon market that they can think about in terms of having a big enough market in order to benefit from having this creation of and development of a carbon market, right? And of course, it remains to be, we of course, as signatories to Paris, and we looking at our intended nationally determined contributions, we have a lot of climate goals that we actually have committed to, and so developing a market would be key in that. And thank you, Zainab, for highlighting it. Great question.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Saadia, for answering the questions. And thank you, Maha, specifically for answering questions in the chat as well and taking everyone's intake for the session. With that, we're going to conclude today's talk.